In this video, we're going to be looking at the novel I, Claudius, and we'll put a standard edition up against the version from the Folio Society. After considering both, it'll be clear why I'm keeping one and ditching the other.
Robert Graves' I, Claudius is a historical novel, first published in 1934. It's presented as the autobiography of the titular character, and it covers 80 years of Roman history told through the lens of the crippled narrator who's ignored and dismissed by his family members. Readers are taken through the end of the reign of Augustus, Tiberius, and Caligula, until Claudius himself stumbles and bumbles his way to the throne. With its emphasis on historical figures and events, some might find this novel a touch dry, but I enjoy it. This is mostly due to the character of the narrator himself. Claudius considers himself a historian, and so he does his best to stick to that approach and style in his writing. But every once in a while, his true character still shows through. He's intelligent and observant and rather funny, but pretends to be what everyone assumes him to be, an idiot. And because he isn't seen as a threat, he has a front row seat to the corruption and horrible political power struggles that occur in the Roman Empire for almost 50 years, before he himself is finally made emperor, after everyone else in his family essentially eliminates each other. This novel features, in my opinion, one of the three greatest literary villains of all time. Claudius's grandmother Livia is an absolute monster and murders many of her own family members in order to maintain her power. Those familiar with Game of Thrones will recognize many influences here. Cersei Lannister may be indebted to Livia, Joffrey Baratheon is similar to Caligula, Tyrion has parallels to Claudius himself, and George R.R. Martin has essentially admitted to basing Stannis Baratheon on the character of Tiberius. The novel also has many direct adaptations, with none more notable than the beloved 1976 BBC television series. The intrigue of witnessing the terrible lengths that many of these characters will go to in order to manipulate and secure political power is frightening at times, but is always compelling. The style of the novel is distinct because in his narration, Claudius uses almost no poetic language. He deliberately avoids metaphors in an attempt to keep his account as objective and historically precise as possible. However, the author, Robert Graves, was himself a poet, and his supreme command of language plays a large part in the novel's success. The writing is carefully measured, so even the longest passages are a true pleasure to read, and the complex and multifaceted politics of ancient Rome are easy to follow. I first read this novel as a young man from a beat-up mass-market paperback that I borrowed from the library. Years later, I picked up this trade paperback edition because I wanted to add it to my home library. This is the 1989 edition from Vintage International. It features an illustration that combines a classical Roman figure in grayscale like a marble statue with modern color elements. It could have stayed in my collection, but when I had an opportunity to upgrade to a more prestigious deluxe hardcover edition, I had to take it. So let's upgrade it.
Now we have I, Claudius from the Folio Society. This version was originally released in 1994 and is presented in a green slipcase. The book is wrapped in a darker green cloth with a gold design. The design is made up of vines, leaves, and apples. This may be classic Roman iconography, or it might be a reference to the text itself, as apples show up in more than a few key scenes. On the spine, we have the title, the author name blocked in gold, and this is one of the only Folio Society editions I own that does not identify the publisher at the bottom of the spine. If we crack the book open, we see heavy printed end papers with a family tree drawn by Dennis Baker. The binding is appropriately finished with green and gold thread, and the top edge of the book is also done in green. The book is printed on alderly wove paper, which is smooth and creamy white, providing that easy reading contrast that the Folio Society is so well known for. If we bring back the Vintage International edition for a brief side-by-side, we can see that both editions feature tight spacing, but the Folio Society has a more generous side margin than the Vintage International, which makes it slightly more inviting to read. The paper is whiter, and the text is blacker and much more crisp. The Folio edition features a unique introduction from Alan Massey. He takes readers through some of Robert Graves' biography and explains the history of the novel's composition. Artist Neil Packer is the real star of the show here. He's provided 8 color illustrations and 20 black and white illustrations in this edition. Mr. Packer's work may be familiar to Folio Society fans who've been lucky enough to see his edition of Catch-22 or the recent Divine Comedy limited edition release. In Folio's I, Claudius, the color work doesn't always land right next to the page where the corresponding text can be found, but the black and white integrated illustrations always fall at the end of their respective chapters. Let's take a look at that artwork. We'll rapid fire through the black and white material. These drawings range in size from a few square centimeters to 3/4 of a page. They seem to be studies or sketches of elements that could appear in the color work, but some, like this image of a ravaged landscape, are wonderful on their own. They aren't haphazardly placed, but instead are used to cap off particularly poignant chapters with an extra flourish, or are haunting echoes back to a key moment in the chapter. As we finish up with the black and white artwork and start moving on to the colored stuff, I'd like to talk about Neil Packer's style here. It's hard to define simply because there's so much going on. He fuses classical and modern elements together using repeated patterns, off-kilter perspectives, architectural elements, simple iconography, and rich color for the backgrounds, and detailed classically rendered nude forms in the foreground, often contorted into unsettling positions that also serve to move the eye around the page. There are elements of ancient Roman artwork here, but the grotesque details and busy compositions remind me of artists like Hieronymus Bosch, along with aspects of more modern surrealism and horror elements too. In this fantastic frontispiece, we see a sort of family tree for the novel, with author Robert Graves at the top. Below him are the first Caesar, Julius, and the fifth Caesar, Nero. Below them are the 4 Caesars that make up the characters of this novel: Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, and Claudius. In the second color illustration, we see a depiction of the fateful day that young Claudius caught a wolf cub falling from the sky in his robes. The third is an illustration of Tiberius during his exile in Rhodes. Note the great detail of the simplified koi fish next to the realistically rendered koi fish at the bottom of this piece. The fourth illustration depicts Cassius Chaerea, who leads his 120 men to bravely charge through a massive German force, with 80 somehow surviving. This is an event that Claudius later calls perhaps the finest soldiering feat of modern times. Neil Packer conveys the slaughter with gore and dismembered arms. The fifth color image depicts Tiberius' struggle to unlock the codex cipher his mother Livia uses. This piece employs textual elements to great effect, while his head is pulled back in demonic anguish. Next up is my favorite of the bunch. It represents the death of Germanicus, and it depicts all the horrors that he's haunted with in his home, including the number 17, the corpse of a baby under the floor, and a decapitated head. It's gruesome and horrific, and the background features a primary color scheme, which is nice, I guess. The seventh image depicts Tiberius' debaucheries and his cruelty. He attacks a fisherman by mangling his face with a lobster and eventually killing him. And the final color image is of the mad Caligula taking acting and dancing lessons. It speaks to the insanity of the character, especially with that flying horse detail. I'm very happy with this edition of I, Claudius. The hardcover and quality binding assure me that it'll last a long time. I happen to have the first print here, though I believe they've released subsequent printings. The book is reasonable on the secondary market, and you can often find a copy for $30 or $40, which isn't much more than you'd pay for a modern trade paperback edition. I hope to one day come across the matching edition of the sequel, Claudius the God, so it can join this one on my shelf. As for my old edition, it's the box of doom for you.
Perfect.
More room on the shelf means more books in the future. As always, thanks for watching, and if you haven't seen them, please consider watching the previous videos in this series.